Welcome to the Hedonic Health Podcast. I'm your host, Tommy DeStefano, and this is episode number 4, another solo episode. And today I'm going to be talking about how I got seduced by the health benefits of lifting weights in my 30s, despite already being pretty physically active, and why I still love it after years of lifting, and then wrap up with some recommendations on how you can get started if you aren't already, or level up your training if you feel like your training is getting a bit stale and you want to change some things up. Now, I'm just a recreational lifter. I've never competed in powerlifting or bodybuilding, and I really don't know anything about Olympic lifting. And I'm guessing the vast majority of folks listening to this have no plans on competing in any of those sports. I'm not especially gifted at lifting. I'm maybe sort of strong for my size, which is just a nice way of saying that I'm relatively small and weak in an absolute sense. I have no aspirations of competing, and I've never coached elite athletes or gotten an academic degree related to exercise science. But that being said, I have enjoyed geeking out on this stuff quite a bit over the past 5 years or so, and I feel like I've gotten a lot out of lifting. I think that consistent resistance training, whether it's with barbells, dumbbells, kettlebells, machines, or whatever, offers some unique health benefits, not just for physical health, but mental, emotional, and social health too. And anybody can benefit from any of that stuff. And ultimately, the whole process can just be a really enjoyable and rewarding thing that is worth investing your time. I think a lot of people are maybe held back from trying resistance training for reasons that could probably be re-examined and re-evaluated, whether it's an identity issue or just a lack of exposure. And so I think it's good for just everyday recreational lifters like myself to kind of come out of the closet and share how awesome some of this stuff can be. I realize this may seem like, sort of a general, broad topic, not the most esoteric topic out there. And there are tons of podcasts that are dedicated to nothing but lifting. But I wanted to do an episode telling my own story because, like I've mentioned in previous podcasts, I got into this at a later stage in life than most folks, so my perspective and motives might be a little different than what the average person thinks of when they think about your typical bro stereotype. And for folks who are already into lifting, I'm hoping my perspective might just add another layer of enthusiasm, maybe add some more reasons to appreciate the work that you've been putting in. And if you've got a hard workout coming up today and you're questioning yourself saying, why am I even doing this? Maybe this can serve as a reminder. But mainly, I'm hoping my perspective may motivate some folks who otherwise hadn't really given it much thought or hadn't considered some of the benefits they might be missing out on. I was definitely in that boat for most of my life. I didn't grow up around gym culture at all, and I don't think my younger self would have ever imagined that I'd be squatting and deadlifting on a regular basis, week after week and year after year when I got older. Putting in time and effort to develop general things like strength and body composition was just something that never crossed my mind when I was growing up. Even when I was starting to get into more physical activities and focus more on my health, if anything, I probably would have just assumed that lifting weights was unhealthy, or at least unnecessarily risky. I didn't really know anybody who was into lifting when I was growing up, and maybe some of you can relate to this. I think my perspective, if I even took the time to have a perspective of it, was that it was just a vain pursuit, done by people who are insecure in who they are on the inside and trying to compensate by looking a certain way or getting caught in this most likely endless and unfulfilling pursuit of competing with other people, which to some of us can seem like an exercise in futility because there will always be somebody better than you out there. And maybe there is some truth in that, but maybe for some people that is what motivates them or what initially motivated them, so maybe even that is a net positive. But obviously there's a lot of reasons that people get into lifting, and most of them are positive. Or maybe you look at the act of lifting weights and it just seems like the most arbitrary and useless thing, picking up and putting down objects that were just manufactured solely for the purpose of being picked up and put down. But really, as arbitrary as it seems, and really you can go down the rabbit hole of meaning and what value does any activity have really, but as arbitrary as it seems, I feel like it's added a lot to my life, and hopefully by hearing my story, you'll get some new motivation or at least a broader perspective. As I mentioned earlier, when I did start to become more physically active and health conscious in my 20s, lifting still never really crossed my mind. I had capoeira, yoga, and hiking, and so comparing myself to the typical sedentary American adult, I felt like I had more than enough going for me to build and maintain all of the physical capacities I needed for my daily life and for aging well. I generally felt good physically, good energy levels, hardly got sick or anything, and wasn't really too concerned that, like, if someone needed a hand moving some furniture or something, I was the last person someone would ask for help, except to, like, hold open the door while the more capable folks did the heavy lifting. If anything, that felt more like a benefit. That just meant I could get away with being a lazy slacker. Of course, as I got older, that started to change. I think that's just a natural shift that as I got older, especially as a guy, and I especially think practicing capoeira, which really espouses self-reliance, and, also being in this capoeira group where we all have to contribute to make the thing run for it to work, kind of nudged me in the direction of wanting to be both a more self-sufficient and a helpful person. Because there are situations in life where you can't depend on other people, and you gotta move your own furniture or whatever, or where you're the one that people will depend on. Plus, it's good to have the capacity to just be a more helpful person. As an adult and someone who is aspiring to better themselves in any way, you want to, as much as possible, be considered an asset to the people around you rather than a liability. Being a stronger, healthier, more able-bodied person isn't just going to benefit you, but everyone around you. So at least philosophically, that started to seep in a bit, and that was a motivating factor for me to get into things like primitive skills and gardening, but that still didn't really provide the catalyst I needed to make the connection to lifting, which was just not at all on my radar at the time. I remember at one point at one of our capoeira training events that our maestri had us do something that seemed really out of character compared to what we usually worked on. He had us doing push-ups, lunges, and ab exercises, things that aren't really specific to capoeira training. He started encouraging us to get stronger. I was like, whoa, you mean capoeira itself isn't everything I need to develop my physical capacities? And in the past, he had pointed out that, well, our capoeira predecessors were ridiculously strong, doing various types of hard work that hardly anybody in our culture does today. These people were working on docks, picking up and carrying super heavy stuff all day. They didn't do capoeira to get stronger. They used capoeira to relax and to loosen their bodies after doing actual hard labor all day. So here we are, a bunch of weak North Americans with sedentary lives, practicing this art, these movements, that typically would be done by guys who are already super strong and muscular. So I started to at least warm up to the idea of doing exercises just to develop some general strength to make up for that deficiency of hard physical stress in my life, instead of insisting on being ultra specific to the activities that I do for just enjoyment and the meaning that I get out of them. The vast majority of us live in this bubble where we don't really have any real intense physical demands in our daily lives to adapt to, so we end up being weak and under-muscled. Like, we talk a lot these days about the health detriments of having too much body fat, but I don't think people talk enough about the lack of muscle mass that most of us have, and I think those two problems kind of exacerbate each other. So I kept up with these push-ups and lunges and ab exercises, and I also remember being at my maestri's apartment, and he had this book sitting around, which I eventually bought, called The Art of Shenku. And this book is hilarious, and it's filled with all kinds of nonsense. It's sort of a humorous comic book style compendium of like every new agey, martial artsy, nutrition, pseudoscience, alternative health approach out there. But it's still super fun and interesting to have around if you're looking for something entertaining or a weird conversation piece to have on your coffee table. Anyways, it had some bodyweight training routines in there, so I added bits of that into my little list of other bodyweight exercises that I'd tacked onto my capoeira training. Still though, I was all about keeping it a do-it-yourself kind of thing with no need for a gym, And I mean, I really hadn't even considered the possibility of going to a gym. That just would have seemed like a waste of time and money spent on the most arbitrary of random things. Plus, I kind of felt like being able to do all of my training on my own terms, when and where I wanted for no cost, fit that self sufficiency kind of mindset. But really, you can do a lot with just at home body, at home body weight kind of training. But if you know any regular lifters who don't have weights at home, they will tell you like, well, body weight stuff is good. There's just something missing there. It's a lot more challenging to get the same kind of muscle building stimulus over time, and even more challenging to find exercises to do that are in the repetition ranges that are more on the strength side of the spectrum as opposed to the endurance side of the spectrum. Not saying it can't be done, but weights can definitely be an extremely useful tool for getting stronger and better body composition. So as time went on, I was getting more into exploring ways to craft my life so that I can be healthier and feel better, perform better, and have the potential to maintain that well into old age. Looking back, I think that Shin Ku book was actually a pretty influential thing because it introduced me to a lot of new ideas at once, and it sort of broadened my view on all these different approaches and things that you could incorporate into your life. I mean, it had everything: Chinese medicine, Ayurveda, all sorts of weird ideas about nutrition like food combining and different diet approaches, all mixed in with like survival skills, how to tie knots, use maps, how to pack your bags to travel lightly. This book was like a miniature internet before the internet was even a thing. And as I mentioned in my last episode, I always approach things with a pretty agnostic mindset. So I had the attitude of, hey, maybe there is something to some of this. Clearly, a lot of it is almost certainly bullshit, but there's some interesting ideas there to experiment and play with and see what happens. And hey, ironically enough, sometimes it's immersing yourself in some bullshit that leads you to discovering some valuable and useful stuff. So, after being exposed to all these weird and wacky ideas, when I first heard about bulletproof coffee and the whole bulletproof diet back around 2013, which I went into on the last episode, the reasoning behind it kind of made sense, and it seemed to have some sort of credibility to it, and I really decided I was going to experiment with it. I was following this diet and reading the internet forums and stuff, and one of the things that Dave Asprey, the founder of the whole bulletproof thing, was really big on was this book by Doug McGuff called Body by Science, and he was really into the whole approach to strength training that he lays out in that book. Now, don't confuse body by science with stronger by science, because they're very different things. But Asprey kind of parroted McGuff's suggestion that any exercise should be like super brief, as high intensity as possible, and once a week at most. Now, I was doing capoeira, yoga, drumming, hiking, all that stuff, so I was like, yeah, whatever, I don't know about your exercise recommendations, but after a while, I did decide that maybe just adding a little bit of this high intensity stuff to my training instead of just doing the at-home like body weight stuff was worth giving it a try. Just a minimum effective dose or something. So, ironically, it was back when I was geeking out on these bulletproof diet forums that was really the first time I encountered people talking about lifting and training, which is pretty ironic because pretty much everybody I know and like everybody that I follow now, whoever references the bulletproof stuff does it as like a joke because it's really like one of the funniest diets to come out of that whole low carb paleo sphere. But I eventually got the Body by Science book and I read it. And while I currently feel like the routine is very much not the ideal approach to training, the rationale and the case that it makes for getting stronger and adding muscle is pretty damn convincing. Doug McGuff, the author of the book, is a doctor, so I guess that kind of helped with the credibility side of things. And it's been like 6 years since I read it, but he goes into all these health benefits that I'd never really considered. All of these low-carb diets, including bulletproof, really emphasize how glucose metabolism is important for health, which is true. Type 2 diabetes is just becoming more and more common. And their solution is to just avoid carbs. Like if high blood sugar spikes are the problem and those are caused by carbohydrates, then just eliminate the carbs. That sounds simple enough. Sugar's the problem. Don't eat sugar. Problem solved. Except that's not how it works. Instead, it seems like we need to improve our insulin sensitivity, which means we need some place for carbs to go when we eat them besides our liver. And it seems like one of the best ways to do that is to increase your muscle mass and to be more physically active in general. Plus, I kept hearing about how things like leg strength, muscle mass, grip strength, all things like that are all associated with longer lifespans. And it makes sense. All the systems of our body interact with one another. Your musculoskeletal system is interconnected with everything else in your body, similar to how your cardiovascular system, your endocrine system, digestive system, and nervous system all are. So you're really training all of these bodily systems whenever you do anything. Whatever you do with your body, not just your training, is going to change all of these systems. So it slowly started to make sense to me that, hey, maybe there is a bit of a gap in my selection of physical practices, sort of a missing nutrient in my movement diet. The Bulletproof diet was also big on supplements, and so I was already pretty open to this idea that, hey, maybe sometimes there are things lacking from our daily lives and physical environments that we need to function our best, and maybe this training thing is just like another supplement. Really, training is way more effective than any supplement, and if you could put the benefits of lifting in a pill, it'd be worth a lot of money, I'm sure. I mean, the amount of money people spend on supplements with no real research supporting them, and the random exotic food fads from fancy health food stores is pretty crazy. I was totally guilty of it too when I was doing the Bulletproof thing. I was taking all of these supplements, vitamins, minerals, etc., most of which probably had minimal to no benefit, and I slowly realized, damn, I could probably just stop taking all of those and add this resistance training stuff into my routine, and it'd probably have way more of a valuable impact on my health. And one really smart selling point about this Body by Science thing, while also kind of being a shitty thing, is that it only takes 15 minutes. I mean, who doesn't have 15 minutes for like an absurd list of awesome health benefits? Everything from metabolism to heart health to bone health. Who knows how many future visits to the doctor's office that can save you in just 15 minutes a week? But hey, for the average sedentary person who doesn't do anything, honestly, going from doing nothing to a consistent high-intensity session every week is actually a huge improvement, so it's not totally worthless. So here's how this Body by Science program works. You do one set of each exercise, you do 5 exercises, and he encouraged machines instead of using free weights if possible, because you were going to take each of these exercises to true muscular failure. His idea was that if you didn't hit failure, you were wasting your time pretty much. And you do each rep super slow, like 6 to 10 seconds on both the concentric, which is the lifting up, and the 6 to 10 seconds on the eccentric, the lowering. And the idea was that you were trying to see how long you could maintain the time under tension, which was the concept that he really stressed. This idea that the time that the muscle was under maximum tension was what gave you pretty much all the beneficial results. So you would time each set and maintain that rep cadence of 6 to 10 seconds up, 6 to 10 seconds down, and pay attention to the exact moment that you hit true muscular failure. And I think it was like after you could do a set like that for more than 2 minutes, you could increase the weight. So yeah, that was a really weird way to train, and I don't really recommend that to anybody. I mean, if that's your thing, that's cool, have fun with it, but I wouldn't have that be my first go-to. I mean, I can still see some, at least, a little bit of positives in it, and it could be said that there are some good benefits to getting a feeling for what it's like to go to failure, and doing that with machines would probably be the safest way to go. And having done a bunch of yoga and capoeira and stuff, I was pretty good about paying attention to my form, and I never injured myself, so no horror stories or anything. And it did feel good to get this different kind of pushing myself, a different feeling of effort than what I was used to. Capoeira can be really intense in a lot of different ways, and so can yoga. But this sort of condensed period of effort applied to a really simple linear thing, just moving a weight from one point to another a couple times, was a very different feeling for me. And I did seem to get stronger for a while, and I gained some muscle, although I also gained more fat than I should have, because another thing about the bulletproof diet was that it was very anti-calorie tracking. And if anything, the message was that people just need to eat more fat to boost their metabolism if they want better body composition. So that message, combined with this new strength training stimulus, just made me want to eat more. And of course, the motto in the lifting community is you got to eat big to get big. So eating a caloric surplus is definitely something you want to aim for. Thankfully, capoeira and yoga were always there to kind of help keep me from going too far off the deep end, because doing things upside down and backwards and twisting your torso around is a lot harder when you're wearing an extra thick coat of adipose tissue. So I stuck with that routine for a long time. Not so much because I was convinced it was the absolute best way to train, but I was just in the routine of doing it and wanted to see how it played out. And I did appreciate that minimum effective dose aspect, that I could just fit it in once a week while still doing all of my other training. Eventually, I did sort of plateau on my progress with it enough that it wasn't really going anywhere, and that approach to training just really got old. Trying to make sure that I was hyped up and ready for this once a week training to failure thing, and if that workout sucked, then well, better luck next week. Plus tracking progress takes a really long time when each training session is spaced out by a whole week, and it's all riding on that one 15-minute workout. Meanwhile, I was coming across more and more arguments against machines as opposed to free weights, especially barbells, and the idea of pushing to failure all the time. I think it was an article by Tim Ferriss or an interview he did with Pavel Tatsuin or something, where I remember them talking about how 5x5 is a great way to progress in strength. And I'd heard about StrongLifts 5x5 in a few different internet forums and heard it was a solid beginner program. So I was like, hey, let's go ahead and do a legit beginner program and see what this barbell training thing is all about. The basic idea behind this program was you do 5 sets of 5 reps on each of the main barbell movements, except for deadlift, which was just 1 set of 5 because they just thought deadlifts are too taxing or something, which I don't know if I agree with that anymore. But anyways, each time you complete all of your reps, you add 5 pounds the next time you do that exercise. And when you can't do all 5 reps, 3 workouts in a row, you go back to 10% lighter weights and work your way back up. I really liked that because there was a really clear line of progression, and there was more opportunity to practice these movements, and I was curious to see where it would take me. I read everything on that StrongLifts website, stronglifts.com, a bunch of times, watched the videos, figured out the form for all the movements, and I read a lot of good arguments making the case for the value of each of these movements, like the squat, the bench, deadlift, row, overhead press, chin-ups, dips. They all seemed really well justified for developing just good all-around general functional strength. Machine exercises were okay, but kind of felt like playing an arcade game or something to me. So these movements like squatting and deadlifting, where you can see the application to daily life, made a lot of sense. And as somebody who had been doing yoga and capoeira for so long, I really appreciated that there was more balance and coordination involved. I think free weights were originally kind of intimidating. Like, why put yourself at any more physical risk than you need to? But the more I learned, the more I realized the benefits far outweigh the risks. Of course, I wouldn't try to do the body by science routine with squats and deadlifts. Yikes. I mean, you just get injured probably pretty easily doing that. So I went looking for the cheapest gym that actually had free weights, because Planet Fitness didn't, and I settled on the YMCA. So I started actually doing StrongLifts in April of 2015. It's about 5 years ago now, and I was as consistent with that as I am with everything else. If there's one thing I'm good at, it's consistency and sticking to routines. Although, as I mentioned earlier, sometimes I'm good at it to a fault. I had also just warmed up to the idea that calories do matter, and had gotten rid of some of that extra fluff from the fucking unintentional bulletproof body by science dreamer bulking that I was doing earlier. Although I did, of course, make another mistake because I'd been kind of hearing that, oh, once you're leaner, you can, you'd be in a great place to put on some more muscle because of nutrient partitioning. So I didn't shy away from putting on more weight again, because, again, I'm the kind of person who doesn't really have to try to be in a caloric surplus, but I at least got stronger, this time with actual barbell movements, and I put on some muscle, but again, a little bit more fat than what I needed. But StrongLifts was at least a good program for getting accustomed to these full body compound barbell movements that could form the foundation for a good trajectory and getting stronger and better body composition in the long run. Nowadays, in a lot of the lifting circles, I'll hear people say bad things about StrongLifts or its predecessor, Starting Strength. And while it may not be the best approach for everyone, I still think it's a decent beginner program. I think some people approach it with maybe too much of an ego or a disregard for form. Again, where having a background in yoga or martial arts or something can come in handy, or a coach. But these people maybe get caught up in putting more weight on the bar at any cost without being honest with themselves when their form falls apart and they refuse to deload. And maybe for those folks, it's not the best place to start. At least, not without a trainer or a lifting buddy to help them stay accountable. Still, I think it's at least a decent starting point for a lot of people. I think that's part of why it's so popular. Of course, it was also just a big internet sensation at a time when there wasn't so much oversaturation, so that helped it a lot. Of course, I succumbed to one of the downsides of StrongLifts, though. I stuck with it for too long. Just because, again, I'm such a routine-oriented person, and I like to give things a full run on their own terms, and program hopping always seemed like a waste of time to me. I'm more of a long-term development kind of person, and even towards the end there, after like 2 years of doing StrongLifts, I still kept feeling like, but I might be able to add another 5 pounds on my squat after this next deload. But one of the downsides of StrongLifts is just that after a while, it does make sense to change things up and probably add some volume, but the recommendation that they give is this other program that does the opposite of that. It lowers the volume with this idea that you are probably like overtraining or something like that, and if you just lower that volume, then you might be able to add, another 5 pounds, Actually, the opposite is true, though, and most folks are going to need to back off the weight and add more volume. The post StrongLifts program that they recommended was this thing that they called Mad Cow, which is just something that a guy on an internet forum threw together with a little bit of variation in the rep ranges, but still less volume. I do remember there being a day where you do some sets of 8, though, and I felt like, hey, that's way different than what I'm used to. That seems like it's actually hitting my muscles in a way that they're like actually ripe for getting a good stimulus instead of just, grinding on my joints like the super heavyweights were. So I was kind of open to this idea of changing things up, and around this time, I had started to come across some of these really informative and entertaining exercise science communicators, people like Mike Israetel and Greg Nuckols. And once I started checking out the content they were putting out, I just went down this rabbit hole of geeking out on the evidence-based sphere of strength and hypertrophy. Reading stuff from those guys and a bunch of, similar folks led me to experiment with with programming my own training, and not completely overhauling everything, but just changing up the volume and intensity on the exercises that I was doing and playing around with a few new exercises or variations. The StrongLift site kind of emphasized this dichotomy between training for bodybuilding and powerlifting, and kind of, painted bodybuilders to be these, big guys, but they were actually weak, and you don't want to train like a bodybuilder if you want to get strong. But of course, it's more of a spectrum than a dichotomy, and there does come a point, especially for smaller frame folks like myself, where it actually makes sense to focus on training for muscle size specifically. Bigger muscles have a better potential for getting stronger, and you probably aren't going to get there just by doing your sets of 5. And of course, bigger muscles are also, going to increase your insulin sensitivity and all that stuff. I think people maybe oversimplify the spectrum and think that, the training for powerlifting is going to be all high weights with low reps all the time, and training for bodybuilding has to be all high reps with moderate weights all the time. But it seems like both probably benefit from varying things up a little bit and kind of dabbling in each other's rep schemes, I guess. So yeah, I went from body by science to strong lifts to programming my own stuff. And so I was kind of compelled to just keep learning and experimenting and just kept developing a bigger appreciation for this whole art and science of lifting. By the time I decided to go into personal training and get certified, I felt pretty validated because pretty much everything in the training certification program I did was stuff I already knew or stuff I could debunk with more recent studies. So none of this stuff has gotten old or boring for me, even though after a while a lot of the information kind of gets repetitive. Occasionally there's still new little nuggets of interesting things to incorporate or experiment with, and that keeps things fresh and interesting. And like most long-term practices, I found a lot of benefits from adding this stuff into my life that I wouldn't have expected when I initially started. That analogy that I used earlier of lifting as a health supplement still makes a lot of sense to me. Like, we have these recommended guidelines for nutrition from the government, like the recommended daily allowance for different vitamins and minerals and stuff. And we do actually have national exercise recommendations from the federal government, and you can look them up if you want. They recommend at least 2 days a week of resistance training that hits most of the major muscle groups. Of course, most Americans don't, actually hit these recommendations, just like they don't with the nutrition. And the recommendations, they're not super in-depth or detailed, but there's at least something in there. But really, and they're just talking minimums for not being totally deficient, like having scurvy or whatever. They're not talking about optimal health and well-being. But if you think about your body as having minimum requirements for movements, I think it makes sense to try to get a diverse array of these movement nutrients if they can improve your quality of life. Now, similar to nutrition, I think we should get most of our movement nutrition from things that we do for their own sake. Like, we should pursue whatever physical activities bring us the most enjoyment or value in other ways. In my nutrition analogy, it's like getting your nutrients from whole foods instead of supplements, which I think is generally a good idea. So for me, capoeira is probably the most nutrient dense and has the most variety of any physical practice that I have, and the one that is the most fun for its own sake. Maybe up there with playing music or something, I guess. Capoeira just works in so many planes of movement and joint ranges at so many different levels of intensity and different contexts, with all this coordination, timing, distance, and strategy involved. That's why I talked about it on my first episode. And yoga kind of fills that gap of taking the time to do some bending, twisting, balancing, and taking my body through its full range of motion on a yoga mat while focusing on being calm and relaxed and paying attention to my body. And I'll probably do a yoga episode at some time in the near future too. But lifting fills that gap of focusing on strength and body composition in ways that those other practices or the rest of my daily life just don't provide, but it still has a bunch of benefits. All of the different activities that I'm into seem to offer different unique psychological benefits, both short-term and long-term. And lifting kind of does its own unique thing. Like, if my day is off or if my mood is off, I still stick to my routine. And that capacity to stick to the routine, even when you aren't really feeling it, is an excellent way to develop some self-discipline. But it also almost always leaves me feeling better. And sometimes the rest of my day will just go better. I get that from capoeira and yoga too, but those require a little more conscious, intentional movement and awareness, so it can feel like a little more work to get into a good flow with those, whereas lifting is a more linear, straight-ahead thing. So it's a lot easier to just get into the zone and direct your effort, if that makes any sense. And then it becomes a learning process of deciding when to back off and when to push yourself, and when maybe you want to push yourself beyond your comfort zone, or maybe when you need to back off when part of you wants to keep pushing. Lifting has also kind of done another thing for me, which is to kind of expand my horizons in terms of my identity and the people I interact with. People of all sorts lift. They do it for different reasons and they have different approaches, but there's still a sense of camaraderie with other lifters. It's not quite as tight knit as something like capoeira, but it's still another avenue for making friends and social networks that you otherwise wouldn't. Especially for somebody like me, who, like, I didn't have any experience with gym environments or athletic, pursuits or anything like that until after I was 30. I'm a bit of an introvert. So it's been a good transition to having another avenue for camaraderie that's a little more mainstream than what I'm used to. Another thing that I've come to appreciate about lifting is that it's sort of a tradition in and of itself with a rich history. The barbell isn't just some random implement that some company came up with. There's a reason that the barbell is the way it is, and the movements that the people use it for have been developed over a long period of time to suit various purposes, just like any other martial art or traditional physical practice. Of course, there's a bit of a balance there between sticking to tradition, what's been done in the past, and what your own body needs and benefits from, and what the current science says. And I guess that's how tradition grows and evolves over time, and I think that's a really interesting thing to see play out. So yeah, after all the ups and downs and everything, I'm still lifting, usually 3 days a week. I'm still just a general recreational lifter, just doing it for strength, health, body composition, and the enjoyment and psychological benefit that I get out of it. I guess at this point, it's less of a supplement almost, and more just a natural part of my life, and I'm glad I keep doing it. Again, I've never competed in powerlifting or bodybuilding and don't have any aspirations of doing either of those things. Nothing against them or anything, they're just not for me. I just think it's really fun. The day before I work out, I'm usually thinking about what tomorrow's workout is going to be like, and I typically listen to like more training oriented podcasts while I have breakfast that day, and then my workout itself usually lasts like, an hour or two, and then afterwards I'm looking back at the workout and, looking at my logbook and seeing how my workout went and what I have coming up in the next workout. I invest a lot more thought and energy into it than necessary, I guess, but I'm conscious of that. And I feel like the enjoyment that I get out of it, though, is really what justifies all of it. So if you're listening to this and you don't already lift, or you haven't in a long time and you're thinking, hey, maybe there is something to this lifting thing that I could benefit from, I would give some thought to what you would like to get out of it and what would be the best approach for you to dive in. Don't just get paralysis by analysis though, or get worried about like, oh, I don't want to do the wrong thing. Just, find something and give it a try. Now, looking back, part of me wishes I would have just gotten into this stuff when I was like a teenager, because I think that would have laid a better foundation for me. But, I also appreciate the things that I did when I was younger, and you can't do everything, so whatever. But get into it sooner rather than later if you can. And I would also almost certainly have gotten way better results if I had a trainer. But that do-it-yourself mindset that I had might not have really allowed for that at the time, and my budget definitely didn't. But if you can get a good trainer, hint, hint, you will get off to a way better start and have a much better trajectory. I mean, any good trainer would have steered me away from the body by science thing pretty quick, and my learning curve with the barbell movements would have gone way quicker. And I would have developed a more personalized program sooner rather than, this sort of one-size-fits-all approach that I did with, body by science and strong lifts. So the money invested would have been a time saver and gotten me better results. But of course, I still appreciate how far I've come and, I don't entirely regret the journey that I've taken so far. If you are a do-it-yourselfer like me, or you just want to avoid the pandemic and get the equipment to train at home or whatever, you can figure out some stuff on your own. Strong Lifts is still around, and you could start there if you wanted just to try it out. But now there's like a whole bunch of other beginner programs out there that you could, probably get better results with. Really my favorite place to learn stuff, and they have free beginner programs too, is strongerbyscience.com. I refer people there all the time for anything strength and hypertrophy related, and their podcast is like my favorite, besides this one, of course. If you're more of a physique bodybuilding oriented kind of person, Renaissance Periodization would be my go-to. And then, Barbell Medicine, they also have some really good stuff too. And So you can go to like renaissanceperiodization.com or barbellmedicine.com. And if you're already lifting and you aren't familiar with those resources, or if you've never worked with a trainer, I'd say start looking into that stuff because it can really reinvigorate your training, and you get a lot more progress and have a lot more fun with it. So that about wraps this episode up. I hope this was at least somewhat interesting for you and maybe broaden your perspective at least a little bit so that you're maybe a little bit more inclined to get into training if you aren't already, or reinvigorated some of your enthusiasm if you already are into lifting and stuff. If you would like to ask me any questions, or if you would like to work with me, either for nutrition coaching or for personal training, you can go to my website at hedonichealth.com and get some more information, or you can email me at hedonichealth@gmail.com. Or if you would like to interact with like a community of other folks that are all kind of into this hedonic health stuff, and you can share your own training journey and stuff like that, you can always visit our Facebook community, which is just titled Hedonic Health. So yeah, I hope this was not a total waste of your time. I hope you found some enjoyment in this, and go and enjoy the rest of your day now and challenge yourself. Do something hard. Lift something heavy. Have fun.